Hi, my name's Shahnaz, and welcome to tonight's ESRC Festival of Social Science event, Race and Religion in Literature. I'm an ESRC Impact Innovation Fellow at the University of Warwick, and I'm going to be your host and chair tonight. I'm really excited to bring you this event, which features some brilliant speakers, some spoken word, and some live visuals. But before I begin, it'd be great to see where the audience is based today. And also, if you could let us know what Bronte or Shakespeare texts you did at school. I know I did far too long ago for me to admit when. Wuthering Heights and Othello. So if my old English teachers in the audience, I do still remember my texts. My fellowship has continued some of the work that we've been doing at the Colonial Hangover Project, which looks at the hidden legacies of empire. And this event has emerged partly as a result of our conversations we've had with our students, and also through some of the conversations I've had with some of our speakers. The journey to this event actually begins with Professor Nisbet's literature tour of Coventry, which really got me thinking about the links that the classics have with empire. After a visit to the Bronte Museum this summer, I got thinking about Heathcliff's origins. Now, I was taught about him being a romantic hero, but a conversation with Sue Newby from the Bronte Museum has really got me thinking about the origins of Heathcliff. And that question that seems to have got you all talking, could Heathcliff be a Muslim? At this point, I also have to give a shout out to the school-age students that we work with. It was a privilege earlier this year hearing students from Link Hall talk about the process of identifying themselves with literature. And this really brings us to the heart of the conversation. How can we make literature accessible to all our students? And how can we help them see themselves in the classics? Tonight, we've brought together three experts to address some of these questions. I'm really excited to introduce them. Sue Newby is the Education Officer for the Bronte Parsonage Museum, and tonight we'll be talking about one of my favourite books, Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff is one of the most mysterious characters in literature. Where does he come from? Where does he disappear to? And what drives his relentless drive for revenge? This talk will look beyond the romance of Wuthering Heights to explore how an insight into the significance of Heathcliff's possible ethnic origins can help enrich our understanding of this powerful novel. Professor Eleanor Nisbet is an emeritus professor at the University of Warwick. Her career specialism was the ethnographic study of the UK's Hindus and Sikhs communities. She's also a font of knowledge of all things literary in Coventry. She'll be introducing Charlotte Bronte's poem Passion as an example of how she sees India as a distant place for her British character's heroism. She has a book coming out, Seek, 2 Centuries of Western Women's Arts and Writing. Lababa Al-Azmi is a literary historian based at the University of Liverpool and the founding editor of Medieval and Early Modern Orient Memos. Memos is a HRC-funded decolonial project that seeks to further knowledge and understanding of the early interactions between England and the Islamic world. Lababa's first book, exploring 17th century English travellers to Mughal India, is forthcoming in 2024 from John Murray Press. Now, I'm really excited to say we've got an original poem being performed for you tonight by Navkiran Kaur-Mann. Navkiran is a Coventry-based writer who has recently performed the original commission poem for the Royal Shakespeare Company production of Faith for the UK City of Culture 2021. Navkiran's writing explores the intersectionality of race, gender and class. She leads a South Asian women's writers group who launched a manifesto for change as part of the International Women's Day, speaking about power dynamics and in silencing of brown women within South Asian cultures to amplify hidden stories. And finally tonight, you'll see some live drawing from the amazing Frances Young. Frances is a multidisciplinary artist. Her work ranges from installations and animation to immersive storytelling, exploring the themes of race and feminist identity. She likes to shine spotlights on marginalized communities. Through art, whether it's engagement workshops or thought-provoking pieces, she hopes to create real-world change. And you'll see her work throughout the evening. We've got people, hello, Pakistan, where they did Othello, Hamlet, Merchant of Venice. We've got people that did Macbeth. we've got people that did Othello as well. And so great to see a lot of Othello people here in the audience, Othello at A-level as well. So welcome. With that, I'm going to bring you on to our very first speaker of the evening, Sue Newby.
Hello, thank you, Shahnaz. I'm really excited to be talking to you today about Wuthering Heights, which is genuinely, I'm not just saying this, it is, I think, my favourite book. It's definitely the book that I enjoy talking most to with students who come to visit us at the parsonage. I think it's because in some ways there's something of a fairy story about Wuthering Heights. It's a kind of fable. It's set in its own little world upon those wild and windy moors. Most of the story takes place in a very small area, a few square miles, and with quite a small range of characters. It all adds to this kind of atmosphere and intensity of the book. You're really drawn into this story, the passion, the love, the hate, the violence, all of that. But you dig a little deeper and it's about so much more. It's a book that asks questions that I think are still relevant to us today. For example, can nature and civilization ever really coexist? Or is there always going to be tension? Can women truly fulfill their real passionate natures, but also fit in with what society expects of them? And most significant with what we're talking about today, what happens when we treat people with brutality and prejudice because of their origins? How does that affect the way they will go on to treat people themselves? So I'm going to focus on the most important character in the book, the one that with the truly mysterious identity, Heathcliff. Most of the other characters rarely seem to leave the few square miles of moorland. Heathcliff is found on the streets of Liverpool. How did he get there? Nobody knows. Later, he hears his beloved Cathy say it would degrade her to marry him. He takes himself off, a penniless 17-year-old, and comes back 2 years later transformed. Where has he been to? What's he been doing? We've got no idea. He's altogether hard to pin down. He starts out oppressed and vulnerable. He becomes the oppressor. The underdog becomes the tyrant. Is he basically a force of nature? Or is he a powerful man of the world? Are we even sure always if he's human? The aspects of Heathcliff's identity that I'm going to really focus on now, though, is where does Heathcliff come from and what are his possible ethnic origins? Now, you might say in a way, what does it matter where he comes from? But it matters because of the time that the book is written and what Emily seems to be saying about colonisation. Most people, if they've read the book and you say, you know, where does Heathcliff come from? Who is he? What they'd say he's a gypsy. That's probably how he's described more than any other way in the book. Now, the origin of the story really begins when Mr. Earnshaw, who's the farmer of the wild Wuthering Heights and the father of Cathy and Hindley, makes this strange, inexplicable journey to Liverpool. He goes there and back in 3 days, which is a bit unlikely. He returns. Instead of the presents he's promised his children, out of his coat falls a dark-skinned gypsy boy. That's how he's described. Speaking as Nellie, who's the servant and also our narrator, describes as speaking gibberish. Mr. Earnshaw has decided to adopt him. He quickly becomes a favoured son. And the inevitable question is asked here is he actually Mr. Earnshaw's illegitimate child? Cathy and Heathcliff quickly form an intense bond that lasts the rest of their lives. They're soulmates running around the moors barefoot, half savage, hardy and free, as Cathy later describes it. So is he a gypsy? We don't know. I mean, perhaps in that fairly isolated place, there are no other points of reference. So they see somebody with a darker skin than themselves and they think he's a gypsy. Whatever he is, he's not white Anglo-Saxon, he's something other. Our next clue is when Heathcliff and Cathy go roaming the moors one evening when they're supposed to be reading their prayer book. They come across a house called Thrushcross Grange. It's a kind of the posh house of the area where the wealthy Lintons live, who are much more cultured and refined than the Earnshaws. They're seen looking through the window, a dog set on them, Cathy's bitten, and taken in, and she's looked after there for a while. But it's the attitude to Heathcliff that is most of interest here to us. He's described as being old Mr. Earnshaw's latest acquisition. He's talked of as though he's property. He's peered at with a kind of horrified fascination, as though he's some kind of alien specimen. Linton even suggests that he'd be doing the country a favour by shooting him now, because he's clearly going to end up on the gallows. In other words, he's got bad lot written all over him. And Linton says an interesting thing. He looks like a little Lascar, or a Spanish or an American castaway. Now, Lascars were sailors who were enlisted often forcibly by the British Army in India, and who'd sometimes be abandoned when they were no longer of use, penniless, thousands of miles from home, quite often in the port of Liverpool. So coming from India at this time, we could be talking about Hindu, or we could be talking about a Muslim. So that is a very definite, interesting possibility. Another clue we have later for a possible Asian origin of Heathcliff is when Nellie is just trying to cheer Heathcliff up, because Cathy seems to have transferred her affections to Edgar Linton. She says, maybe your mother was an Indian queen and your father a Chinese emperor. Going back to the incident outside Thrushcross Grange, Linton also describes Heathcliff as looking like a Spanish or an American castaway. Spanish here, meaning most probably South American, colonized by the Spanish. So we have India, China, America, by connection Africa, South America, all colonized places. Perhaps the most interesting reference here, really, the one kind of with the most mileage, if we're thinking about Heathcliff's origin in a way, is America. Now, remember, Heathcliff is found on the streets of Liverpool, where he was found in the 1760s. Wuthering Heights is actually a historical novel, so we can trace it back to the period. Liverpool was the biggest slave port in the world at this time. So a dark-skinned boy is found there by Mr. Earnshaw, who says he looked for its owner. That is a strange phrase to use about a child. But what if this boy is possibly an escaped slave and therefore somebody's property? Slaves were sold at markets in Liverpool at this time, also advertised in newspapers as missing, with a reward offered. So does Emily make Heathcliff dark-skinned because she wants to add an element of mystery to the story, a sense of the unknown, of danger, a kind of Byronic figure almost? Or is she actually making a comment about slavery or about colonized populations? The British Empire at this time was becoming the most powerful in the world. People were making vast fortunes on exploiting commercially the populations of other countries. In the case of Africa, also of enslaving them. Now, when Heathcliff overhears that Cathy intends to marry Edgar, he disappears for 2 years and he comes back rich and bent on revenge. He's lost Cathy, so he goes about getting possession of first Wuthering Heights and then Thrushcross Grange. He even marries Edgar's sister Isabella as part of this desire for revenge and treats her terribly. So he begins to appropriate land that isn't his. He subjugates the population. He takes possession of the women. And all this carries on into the next generation, which you've not really got time to talk about. So Heathcliff becomes, to all intents and purposes, a colonizer in reverse. Maybe he embodies a kind of unease that people were feeling about what was happening in the British Empire at this time. So we're going to these other countries, we're subjugating the populations, making vast fortunes. What if one day this kind of dark, savage energy is going to come back and do the same thing to us? And we're going to be the oppressed ones. So maybe she's kind of tapping into this unease. Maybe Emily is saying there is a price to pay. We're not going to get up. We're not going to get away with this. It's true that Emily never makes it clear where Heathcliff comes from. We're not supposed to know. Liverpool was a big a huge international port. He could have been a slave from America, originally from Africa. He could have been a Lascar from India. He almost could have been from anywhere. We're not really supposed to know. But I think that the idea that he represents a kind of colonized and the oppressed is almost too, we can't ignore that, you know. Emily isn't writing about slavery or colonialism. She's not making it that simple for us. She's not closing the story down in that way. But it's one of the many rich possibilities of the book. And I think she makes it all the more powerful by making us have to really work at it and think about it. And it's just part of the greatness of the book, in my opinion. So I'm finished and I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. And it's been brilliant to see some of the comments. Rabia has said that she thinks that this would be a great way to introduce diverse interpretations when introducing Wuthering Heights to students. And Rabia, I can say it's well worth taking your students up to the Bronte Parsonage Museum. And Francis's drawing is on screen right now and is absolutely amazing. I'm really excited now to have Navkiran Corman perform a poem which speaks to the themes that Susan's just been talking about. This has been specially commissioned for today, and we're really privileged to have Navkiran perform. Thank you.
Thank you. This poem's entitled Heathcliff. They found you, wandering, orphaned, broken, and alone. They found you and took you in. 'Twas the Christian thing to do. Your dark skin marked by the scars of your past, your fitful dreams haunt you. Do we see you, Lascar, as you are? The skin that you're in? Are you the son of the Emperor of China? Is your mother an Indian queen? Did trade ships cross the seas to bring you in, slave cargo deposited at the Liverpool docks? Dear reader, I leave this to your imagination. The indignity of Heathcliff's otherness, no fixed address or identity, the dark-skinned gypsy, traded and treated like a slave so cruelly. To be a human with no clear definition, inhumanity inflicted on generations, supremacy, what does that mean? That white is clean? Hands made dirty by the blood on the plantations, made riches in nations, built on sweat and tears. Your pain builds up my ivory tower, upon which I look down on you. Heathcliff, did I dare not define you, or choose to? My words left you to be a mystery, a romantic fantasy, projected exoticness, an indefinable desire to experience another's difference. Yet the greatest love story couldn't bridge what humanity has torn apart, the desire to be known and loved just as you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely really powerful. Thank you so much. Before we go on to our next speaker, Professor Eleanor Nisbet, who will also be looking at the work of Bronte, we've got a comment from Amar Inglo. It's the framing of the dark boy makes me also remember the portrayal of a similar boy in a poem, I think, by Kipling. And it's really interesting to see those similarities in those works of authors when dealing with the empire. So now it's my great privilege to introduce Professor Eleanor Nisbet, who will also be talking about Bronte.
Thank you very much indeed, Shahnaz. It's a great pleasure to be here. Could I have my first slide, please? Oh, wow. So the first slide is actually, in a way, the beginning of my story relating to Charlotte Bronte and the First Anglo-Sikh War, because in collecting together the paintings and photographs and the writings of Western women, mainly European women, writing about Sikhs, and painting and photographing Sikhs, I came across Charlotte Bronte. Of course, I'd come across her before, but not with any particular connection to Sikhs. And I expect you know that in Coventry, at least, 1 person in 20 identifies as Sikh, and there are probably Sikhs amongst you. So forgive me if I say things you know already, and I hope that you'll think of questions to ask and that you'll also answer some that I throw out as I go along. Next, please. Yeah, so this is my title. I should have said that the picture on the cover, in case anyone wonders, was of a Gurdwara, a Sikh place of worship called Taran Taran in Punjab. And Punjab is going to be a place that I mention quite a bit. The first Anglo-Sikh war, for example, occurred in Punjab on the banks of mainly on the banks of the Satluj River. Next, please. Next slide. Until a year or two ago, I would have been very surprised to see Charlotte Bronte, here as she is portrayed by George Richmond in 1850, and a picture of a very enthusiastic looking British soldier taking part in the Battle of Sobraon in February 1846. I'd have been very surprised to see those two together, and I'd have thought, what on earth is the connection? And maybe some of you already know, because I need to confess at this point that I'm neither a specialist in colonial or imperial war history, nor in English literature and the Brontes, even though one of my first encounters with Charlotte Bronte was in India. Next, please. How I got involved. Yes, in the 1970s, can you believe it? I was teaching Jane Eyre in India to a class of mainly Punjabi pupils in a place called Nainital. And there are all sorts of allusions in Jane Eyre to India, as you will know if you've read it. What I remember after all these years is that when we got to chapter 8 and a description of Helen Burns, Jane's friend, we read, in that attitude, she remained silent as an Indian, and my whole class erupted in laughter, because the last thing that any of them would have thought of themselves as being was silent, and it certainly wasn't the impression I had. And then, as I say, after all these years, I'm writing Sikh 2 Centuries of Western Women's Art and Writing. Next, please. So what I will do is, first of all, read you some verses, and you can read them, of course, from a poem by Charlotte Bronte, published, not just written, but published in 1846, probably in May of that year. And as we read through it, just look for any of the words that relate to India, to Sikhs, to Punjab, and to the experience of a British person over there. And these words are supposedly those of a man, a British man who is passionately in love with someone who seems perhaps to be less impressed with him than he would wish. And so he's basically saying, look, just tell me and I will go off to India and I'll fight in the war with the Sikhs. I'm willing to die so that I can conquer you and get your love. Some have gained a wild delight by daring wilder sorrow. Could I gain thy love tonight, I'd hazard death tomorrow. Wild, long, the trumpet sounds afar. Bid me go, where Sikh and Briton meet in war, on Indian Satlujes flow. Next, please. Blood has dyed the Satlujes waves with scarlet stain, I know. Indus's borders yawn with graves, yet command me, go. Though rank and high the holocaust of nations steams to heaven, glad I'd join the death-doomed host, were but the mandate given. No, my will shall yet control thy will so high and free, and love shall tame that haughty soul. Yes, tenderest love for me. Next. I'd die when all the foam is up, the bright wine sparkling high, nor wait till in the exhausted cup life's dull dregs only lie. Then love thus crowned with sweet reward, hope blessed with fullness large, I'd mount the saddle, draw the sword, and perish in the charge. Now, I don't know about you, but as I was reading through, the sort of words that struck me were death and blood and graves, and that odd word Holocaust of nations. This is long before the Holocaust that we may be thinking of in the 20th century. A Holocaust originally meant a sacrifice that was burnt completely on an altar. Words like death doomed, die, draw the sword, perish. It's all about fighting, about conquest, about death. And we've got the word Sikh there, spelt differently from how we do today, S-E-I-K. Now, in 1846, we've got the Bronte sisters sitting, scribbling away in Haworth Parsonage in West Yorkshire. It's the year before the three sisters publish their first novels. It's also the year when, as I said, in May, they publish poems, not under their own names, poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. And at first, in the first year, they sell just 2 copies, which is not very encouraging for any poet. Now, in Punjab, in the same year, 1846, after 8 battles, the first of 2 Anglo-Sikh wars comes to an end. The war has broken out following the death in 1839 of the great Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and following a few years of complete turbulence, mayhem and murder, as the British, waiting the other side of the Sutlej River, are really waiting for their chance to perhaps have greater power over the kingdom and maybe even annex it. And meanwhile, Maharaja Dalip Singh, Ranjit Singh's young son, remains the nominal ruler. Now, this may be of interest to anybody who actually comes from South Asia, from India or Pakistan. By the Treaty of Lahore in that year, 1846, the Sikhs give to the British East India Company Jalandhar Doab, which happens to be the part of Punjab that the majority of Sikhs in this country, in the UK now, come from. And also, by the Treaty of Amritsar, the East India Company sells Kashmir. The British have gained Kashmir at the end of this war, but they would rather have some money, so they sell Kashmir to Gulab Singh, who becomes its Raja, its ruler. So we've got these 2 lots of events, very different from each other: quiet life but productive life in the parsonage in Yorkshire, and turbulence and British victory in the Punjab. And how is it that Charlotte actually gets to know about this? Now, probably, the picture that I showed you at the beginning next to her face was the Battle of Sabran in February 1846. She's publishing in May, I think, and it takes at least 6 weeks for news to travel to Britain from India and vice versa. The newspapers, local newspapers in Britain, are publishing news of the end of the Anglo-Sikh War in April, even though it's ended in February. And Charlotte must have read these accounts and been so impressed and inspired that she writes her poem. Next, please. Next. Yes. So Charlotte intertwines inseparably, I think, feelings about gender, about relations between the sexes, and feelings about India. India is imagined as the place for military combat, for male heroism. It's a place in Jane Eyre, of course, for heroism in terms of missionary service, a service to India, converting people to Christianity and educating them. But in Passion, the poem, we have the imagined male lover offering to go to India, not to be a missionary, but to risk his life, demonstrating his love. But it's a love which means controlling the will of the beloved, and winning her as his prize. In Jane Eyre, the Reverend St. John Rivers demands that Jane demonstrate her love by being a missionary wife. In both cases, India is the place for men's suicidal bravado, for triumph and control over the people in India, over women, whether through Christian mission or through military conquest. And at the same time, this is balanced by women's self-sacrificing submissiveness, whether it's going as a missionary wife or whether it's in some other way. For example, Charlotte Bronte also wrote a poem published at the same time in 1846 called The Letter. And here we have someone writing to her husband who is, she says, remote colonial wiles detain her husband, loved though stern. And she, mid that smiling English scene, weeps for his wished return. So the other way in which women were being, as it were, submissive and self-effacing and subordinated was through being deserted, being left behind in England, while their men were doing this heroic thing amongst the Sikhs or amongst Indians more generally. Very, very interesting. It would be really interesting to hear some of your views about this. And thank you very much for listening to my efforts to share Charlotte Bronte, the First Anglo-Sikh War, and what may have been her own perceptions of British colonialism and of relations between men and women.
Thanks
you so much.
So much. That was absolutely brilliant. And I have to say, I didn't realise the links between Charlotte Bronte and India, or having done Jane Eyre at school, realise those passages about India. So that's brilliantly new for me. And actually that comment is echoed by Luqman Ahmed, who has put, this is all relatively new to me, but has sparked an interest so that I can gain a better understanding of the literature presented in this session. Thanks so much, Luqman. And Ahmad has said, and about sledge, is today it's at some places acts as the international boundary between Pakistan and India. And if you have any questions for either Eleanor or Sue, please put them in the chat and we will come to them later. I'm really excited about this next speaker. Othello is one of my favourite Shakespeare plays. I've watched many different iterations of it, and every time I come back to it, there is something new for me. So I'm incredibly excited for this next speaker, Baba Al-Azami, who is an amazing scholar and who I'm going to just let talk without further ado, because I'm really excited for you all to see the presentation today.
Thank you very much, Shahnaz. It's an absolute privilege to be invited and to be asked to talk about Othello. It is unquestionably my favourite Shakespearean play, and it is the play that keeps on giving. And I think that, you know, the Islamic element of Othello is something that's been slightly overlooked. And so it's a real privilege to be able to talk about it today. So thank you very much. Great. So the slide is up. Thank you very much. And thank you to the technical wizards in the background who are dealing with the slides and everything. So I'm going to be talking about Othello. Like many of you here, I also read it during my A-levels, and the view of Othello that I received looking back was quite a narrow and quite a restrained sort of view of what is really a richly global and vibrant play that talks to a lot of the upheavals taking place in England and England's global shift during this period. So I'm going to be particularly thinking about Othello and who he is, what he represents, and what does it mean to be a Moor of Venice. Shahnaz, if I happen to go over, please prod me because I do get enthusiastic about this subject. So if we could have the next slide, please. So I'm going to start with a little bit with the context in which Shakespeare was writing, and because we know that theatre essentially fed off what was going on around them. So theatre was a great space to really see the commentary of events taking place in England and around the world. So we're going to start a little bit earlier than Othello's production, which was around 1603, 1604. And we're going to be looking a little bit at the Reformation. Now, the Reformation was in the 16th century, and it was triggered by Elizabeth I's father, Henry VIII. We all know the man who married too many women. So it was triggered because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, which meant he wanted to leave his first wife, and the Pope wouldn't let him, etc., etc. And long story short, he goes ahead, breaks with Catholic Europe. England becomes Protestant. He becomes the head of the church, and he marries Anne Boleyn. After this, the Pope is very upset, so he excommunicates Henry VIII, which means he basically throws him out of the church. So that was a big upheaval that took place in England. Now, Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, they had a daughter, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth went on to becoming one of the greatest Tudor monarchs to rule over England, as we know. And Shakespeare was writing during the reign of Elizabeth I. Now, in 1570, a particularly interesting thing happened, which was, like her father, Queen Elizabeth in 1517 got excommunicated by the Pope. Now, Elizabeth was obviously staunchly Protestant. She couldn't care less what the Pope thought of her personally. But by being excommunicated, what that meant was Elizabeth and her and her land, England, was effectively evicted from Catholic Europe. So that meant that relations with Catholic Europe was severed. So trade relations, diplomatic relations, military relations. So England was isolated. And so what Elizabeth decided was what she needed to do was make fresh partnerships elsewhere. It sounds a little bit familiar. This was an early modern Brexit. And so much like today, although today it's slightly self-inflicted, but today, much like today, Queen Elizabeth turned around and started thinking, who else can I make partnerships with? And who she turned to was East, and particularly the Ottoman Empire and North Africa, as well as India and Safavid Persia, but particularly the Ottoman Empire and North Africa. And these were Islamic lands. So Elizabeth effectively decided to create these fresh partnerships with the Islamic world. In 1578, she sent her first ambassador to the Ottomans, William Harborne, and the trade negotiations that Harborne negotiated with the Ottomans lasted for the next 2 to 3 centuries, and England continued having very strong relations with the Ottoman Empire. In 1592, Elizabeth established the Levant Company, and this was the trading company that directly dealt with trade with the Ottomans and with North Africa. So under Elizabeth, England became hugely globalized, and it meant a lot of interaction, a lot of migration, a lot of transport of goods and peoples. So England was developing a fresh new globalized identity. And this was the context in which Shakespeare was writing. Just to give it a flavor of how globalized England was becoming. Now, Elizabeth maintains correspondences with the Ottoman Sultan and the Sultan's chief consort. The Ottoman Sultan was Murat III, chief consort was Sophia Sultan. And in 1593, Elizabeth sent Sophia Sultan a set of gifts and with her ambassador. And Sophia Sultan graciously accepted it, and she said, well, what would the Queen like in return? Now, Elizabeth had actually told her ambassador to tell Sophia Sultan that a suit of princely attire, being after the Turkish fashion, would, for the rareness thereof, be acceptable to England. So Elizabeth effectively requested a set of Islamic clothes. And Sophia provided it. She sent the Queen a top gown of gold, an undergown of silver cloth, and an embroidered girdle. So what we're seeing here is this transformation and enrichment of English culture by global interactions right from the monarch. Now, what this did was relations with the Ottomans started creating some tensions because people didn't trust the Ottomans. The Ottomans, and as well as North Africa, these were some of the most powerful empires in the world. The Ottoman Empire was the most powerful in Europe. And what they were doing was they were expanding across Europe, both militarily with their imperial campaigns, as well as demographically. Swathes of people were converting to Islam in the lands that they were conquering, as well as people like travelers and pirates and all kinds of people traveling to Ottoman lands and becoming what they called turning Turk in that time. So theatre started engaging with this and engaging with this new reality, with a queen who was engaging with the Ottomans so deeply and going so far as to wear Ottoman clothes. So So in England, you had this plethora of what was known as Turk plays. So examples of this, you can see on the screen, The Tragedy of Salamis by Robert Greene, which was published in 1594 and was a drama based on the Ottoman Sultan Selim I. There's also a Christian Shah Turk, but also Shakespeare's Othello was one of these Turk plays. And it was produced in the context of this increasing association with the Islamic world in Turkey and North Africa. Okay, we can go to, sorry, I forgot to ask you to shift screen. If you could switch to the next screen. Sorry, there you can see the images of the Turk plays I just mentioned. If we could just go to the next screen now. So we know when we think about Othello now, we usually think, particularly in modern times, we think about Othello's blackness. He is a black character. What does it mean to be a black character in a Shakespearean play? And this is a hugely important aspect of Shakespeare and of Othello and what he represents and what he does in this play. And you also see discussions around the use of blackface and the historic reality that white actors performed Othello in blackface, and what does that mean? Perhaps one of the most famous examples is Laurence Olivier in the 60s when he performed Othello, and he was known to have spent hours applying his makeup and then buffing it with a silk handkerchief to make him shine, which is why he has this really odd shine in that production. And so there's, of course, a lot of problems and contentions about a white person performing in blackface. And obviously, this is a very, very problematic thing. But the discourses around Othello has focused primarily on blackness, but specifically blackness as color. But it's important to understand that race and racial difference is not only about complexion. A racialized figure has multiple intersecting layers of difference or otherness, such as ethnicity, such as religion. It's not simply about complexion. And this is something that critical race scholars will also tell you. So in that regard, Othello is no different. He isn't just black, but he is a Moor. He is the Moor of Venice. Now, what does the Moor of Venice actually mean? If we could just go to the next slide, please. Okay, so Moor in this period is actually quite a fluid term. It describes a specific set of racial others. So in terms of location, a Moorish person is anyone from North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, or Spain, but specifically Muslim Spain, not Catholic Spain. In terms of religion, they're Muslim, they're Islamic. And in terms of race, they're black or brown. So that's what Moor is. So Othello as a Moor is therefore of Islamic heritage. He was born Muslim. If we just go to the next slide, please. So if you go back just a century, these are images from the 19th century of Othello productions, and he looks rather Arab, doesn't he? So Othello is of Islamic heritage and he is Muslim. And you can see in these images that he was portrayed in this very Middle Eastern way. He's got a turban, he's wearing long brocade robes. He's really channeling an Arab appearance, a Muslim appearance in these productions. So from the beginning of the play, Othello is marked for difference. The title is Othello, the Moor of Venice, right? He is not fully Venetian. His citizenship is qualified as Moor. He's the Moor of Venice. He's not Venetian. But he's also questionable as a Moor because he's converted to Christianity, which is something we see in the play. And he's been baptized. Iago refers to his baptism. So he occupies a middle space. He's not able to be fully Venetian nor fully Moor. It is these several layers of racial difference as a born Muslim, as black in complexion, of Ottoman or North African heritage that he battles with right to the end. Even in his portrayal on stage, such as the images you can see on the screen, he's not permitted to discard his Islamic heritage, despite being a Venetian general, despite rising in the ranks of society, despite being noted for his nobility and being able to woo a Venetian lady. Can you go to the next slide, please? Now, we know that Othello is a convert to Christianity. Why is it that he's still a Moor? So we know that, Iago speaks of Othello's baptism in Act 2, Scene 3. And in the same scene, Othello breaks up a brawl, declaring, "Are we turned Turks, and to ourselves do that which heaven hath forbid the Ottomites? For Christian shame put by this barbarous brawl." So he's really emphasizing his Christianity, and it's established very clearly that he is a Christian now. He's converted. and he's very clearly Christian in belief. So why is he still a Moor? Why is he still the Moor of Venice, a Moor of Islamic heritage, of North African heritage? Why is he not considered simply Venetian now? Now, in this period, conversion was actually hugely contentious. And this was in part because of the many Christians who were converting as a result of Ottoman expansionism. So there was a term for this. It was called turning Turk, as I mentioned earlier. And so this led to Turk plays that specifically dealt with conversion or renegading. So you can see on the screen, there's The Renegado by Philip Massinger, which is a very famous play that specifically deals with conversion to Islam. There's also Christian Turned Turk, which is another famous play that deals with Christian conversion to Islam. So this was a concern and a very conscious discourse and concern in Shakespeare's England around what it means to change faith, and specifically what it means to change from the Christian faith, which was believed to be the truth, to this heretical religion of an other society. To Islam, which was considered a heresy and considered paganism. So, so people who converted, they were considered shifty, untrustworthy. They're changing their authentic self, right? But Othello, he kind of turns this on his head. He's not a Christian convert to Islam. He is a Muslim convert to Christianity. So here the idea of turning Turk is turned on itself. But however, he is still, because of the way that conversion was understood in this period, he's still considered to be shifty, to be untrustworthy in terms of his faith, to be trying to change what his authentic self is, which is that he was born Muslim. So no matter how he rose in Venetian society, he can't shake his Islamic past. As a Venetian general, a man of nobility, he married Desdemona, he is still the Moor of Venice, a beast with two backs, sooty-bosomed with thick lips. No matter what he does, he's still a Moor, someone who is Islamic, someone who is from the Islamic world. So I'd like to end with what is perhaps, to me, the most powerful passage in this play. If we could just go to the next screen. So this is Othello's final statement. I'm not going to. I was going to read the whole thing, but I think I'll spare you the long oration. Now this is Othello's final speech before he kills himself. And what we see in this passage is Othello is returning to his Islamic roots. He says, if you see in the lines which I've made bold, "Speak of me as I am." And then he refers to like the base Indian. So he's aligning himself with the Indian. India in this time was ruled by the Mughal Empire. It was an Islamic empire. Drop tears as fast as the Arabian trees their medicinal gum. He's aligning himself with Arabia, which is also, a region known for Islam. He said, and in the final line particularly, he says, and say besides that in Aleppo once, where a malignant and turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and I smote him thus. And that's when he kills himself. So in the Iago famously gave no reason for his scheming in Othello. Why did he drive Othello to the distraction that he did? So ultimately, Othello seems to determine that the reason is who he is. He's a Moor, a Muslim, a black man. He cannot shake his identity, and so he seeks to finally destroy it. In the final act, Othello centers himself as a Muslim, an identity that throughout the play he could not overcome. And in his final suicidal action, he seeks to destroy that identity once and for all. He is the base Indian, he is the Arabian, he is the malignant and turbaned Turk, and he accordingly kills his Muslim self for his final release. And that, if we could just go to the final scene, thank you.
Thank you so much, and that has sparked such a discussion. I also received a message from a school watching who were excited to see Ira Aldridge, who has, of course, particular connection to Coventry, in your slides. I'm just going to highlight some of the many comments. Rabia says that Othello was taught in a very narrow way without any room to delve deeper into culture and what that brings to the character. Luqman, I think, really touches upon an issue which is really important, that students say, especially the younger generation, are aware of the themes to relate to and engage with the content provided. And Ahmed is bringing some amazing history about how it's taught in Pakistan, but also brings up a brilliant real world thing where he's gone. The Othello case and him being portrayed as a black makes me remember the episode where Dada Bhai Nurji, a first Indian MP of the Commons, was called a black man by Lord Salisbury during election campaigns. Thank you all so much for these rich comments. We've only got 8 minutes left, so I'm afraid I'm going to, if anyone's got any questions, please let us know. But I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask you all a quick question, which I think there are lots of school kids which are very excited to know. And it's how in all these, how do they, as students of colour or as working class students, begin to see themselves in these texts? If you were advising someone who's reading these works for the first time, how would you do that? Barbara, if I could start with you.
Sure. So, I mean, as a literature student, when I was in school and when I started university, I didn't see myself very much in the literature we were taught because it wasn't taught in that way. But what I've come to understand, and particularly, as an early modernist, my focus is on the 16th and 17th centuries, that the way in which we've come to understand these texts have been very narrow and has entailed a lot of removal of history, removal of context. So, for example, in Othello, when you consider Othello in its context, which is really, literature is a product of its times, right? So when you consider Othello in its context, then these worlds start opening up, right? So when you consider Othello in its context and you see that England was developing this new globalized identity, not necessarily because they wanted to, but because of compulsion, they got kicked out of Europe. You start realizing that these plays are actually talking to a far larger audience and a far larger reality than what we have often been taught. So for me, it's quite easy to see myself in these literatures because these literatures are actually a lot more broader than we often realize, and a lot more broader than we may have been taught.
Brilliant, thank you, Susan. And just to remind people, if you are interested in visiting the Bronte Museum, we'll be working with them this year to bring those of students up. So, Susan, how would you recommend people reading these texts for the first time?
Well, I mean, I really agree with what's just been said. And just to say, I studied Othello in the 70s for A-level, and my understanding of it would have been so much richer if we'd had that kind of context, So I think it's probably the same with a book like Wuthering Heights. It would have been read more for kind of metaphysical themes about love, about what it means to be human, and so on, which are all really interesting. But you have a look at what was happening at the time when Emily wrote it. What we know about, for example, the father campaigned against slavery. We know the Brontes grew up reading about the so-called colonial adventures in Africa and making up stories about this. Their juvenilia is all about that. And seeing how unlikely it might seem at first, but all these things feed into, what a book like Wuthering Heights is really about. And I think if you do kind of just go into that level of understanding it, and look at the character of Heathcliff. Why does he become the way he becomes? What might his origins be? Why do people treat him the way that they treat him? I think that does open up a lot of really interesting questions.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And I think for school kids listening, that's a really great way of looking at it, by looking at what was going on at the time. Eleanor.
Yes, I would absolutely endorse what both of you have said. I think it's just so interesting to see literature in the context of history and geography. And I wish that I'd had a chance to think about these issues before I headed off to India in the 70s and found myself teaching English literature. I remember my embarrassment when, I think it's Twelfth Night, there was a footnote explaining that the line that includes an Indian beauty was a contradiction in terms, because everybody knew that you that, well, anyway, I don't need to go on any further. I was so embarrassed. I really wanted to sort of erase it from the book. I hadn't got the courage to get into discussing what might underlie it. And similarly with Jane Eyre, I think I missed a lot of opportunities, and I would encourage people every time they come across a word like Turk, or Turk turns up in Jane Eyre as well, sitting like a Turk, cross-legged like a Turk, or Indian, or whatever, to explore that. And particularly if you have family connections, or you have neighbours or friends who may have connections, to really explore how this literature from an earlier generation is illuminating actually a history which in various ways we share, even though we come from different communities that were very differently positioned at that time. So yes, I see literature and history and geography going very much hand in hand. And I think we just need to question our teachers and our lecturers, and our teachers and lecturers need to be engaging with their students about what may be very, very personal in their own reaction and their own experience, because of being differently positioned in terms of family heritage.
Brilliant. That, I mean, and that's so important that they are able to engage with them. And I think we all had the same reaction to that. I've received a comment. I don't think we've got enough time, but actually it would be amazing to get people to perhaps write in and let us know what they think about this. And should these texts also need to be approached from the lens of colonial theorization, even more than simply linguistics? So I think that is a great thing for people to start thinking about. I think we are coming to the end of the evening. We've got some more comments going. It's an insightful session. Well done. Thank you, Luqman. And Rabia talking about Othello again, going, I think that the biggest obstacle at the moment is trying to explore Othello fully with students that are already challenged by the language. My thanks to everybody that's here on a Wednesday, I was just about to say Tuesday evening. I'm getting the wrong day. Thank you so much. A recording will be going out to schools, and please email us to continue the conversations. And if you want to get involved, the Warwick Institute of Engagement, I've just put in some more things which are happening as well. But thank you so much. And wherever you are in the world, please give our speakers a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank
you. Yes, it's been a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you.